We are going to have Susanna report back for our group.
Excellent.
Great. Yeah, sorry, just getting those last comments from people in the chat box. Yeah, so we had a really lively discussion about environmental justice issues as related to Sigma. And in terms of the question of how can we improve implementation of 2020 plans and also ensure 2022 plans are more effective, we had a lot of different ideas, including, really thinking about in light of COVID-19, really working from at the top. So DWR and state funding to help NGOs participate more and really empower community members to actively participate in GSAs or advisory groups. And this might look like actually making a requirement that drinking water disadvantaged community reps are on governing GSA boards, or a required role on GSP advisory boards, which isn't the case right now necessarily. And that we saw yesterday in the breakout sessions that, outreach and stakeholder engagement were top priorities for environmental justice, and that there isn't a lot of representation currently. So something that could make that really happen is requiring that to be the case. Yeah, and then also, that could also happen as these plans are reviewed, that DWR, the State Water Board, could shift the process here to make those requirements and to provide funding for that to be able to happen. And then the other thing that really came forward is these acts that are already in place. So the Bilingual Services Act and the Brown Act are already in place, but aren't necessarily being enforced. And we as NGOs could really be using that as a way to leverage what needs to happen in light even of COVID and the added barriers to participation. So using the tools that are already there within the legislation. And then the other question, how can we better collaborate to do all of this? Like I said before, really advocating for funding directly to the NGOs that are doing this kind of work to fill in the gaps where the GSAs haven't been able to come forward and do that. And then the other thing is really thinking about, some low tech solutions that we can use in this time. Phone call trees, things that are really low barriers to access. And then there were some resources shared that Amanda and Connor brought forward, some guidance documents that I think they're going to share with Emily, and then Emily will share out with the whole group. So that's that. I hope that covers most of it. Sorry if I missed something from our group, but it was a rich discussion.
That was great. Thank you.
Good job.
Thanks, Susanna. Group 2, climate predictions. Pablo, or your designated reporter.
I believe I'm the designated reporter as the note taker. This is Jennifer. So it was a pretty lively discussion and a pretty wonky discussion. And I think some of the general pieces that came out of it was just how difficult it is for climate to be properly analyzed at the local level and properly evaluated, and how you connect that with management actions. And there was a lot of, sorry, Craig, I think you're on the phone. There's a lot of DWR bashing. So because the guidance does a lot of averaging, which is not something that's generally recommended. And the guidance doesn't actually help local GSAs understand how to use the information they receive. So a lot of them are confused about which extreme they're supposed to be planning for, and it's a little intimidating. There's also the discussion that we better integration of agencies that do climate work or have climate responsibilities. So there's a lot of references to the IRWIMP requirement to do climate modeling, which is not part, to do regional modeling, which was really helpful in Ventura County. And so what we're looking at is how you improve that guidance and how you link that more clearly to management actions, because it's not clearly linked now. How you better integrate agencies that have those climate responsibilities, and how you can improve specific regional modeling, maybe with the information that we're getting from the GSPs now. And as a collaborative, we thought we can advocate for that integration of climate impacts. For example, looking at what an extended drought might do to drinking water supplies. Think about having DWR work at the local level to have those discussions on climate, improving local understanding of climate by developing fact sheets, general fact sheets so the public can understand the issue, and try to amend the legislation, SGMA legislation, in a way that reflects, that better integrates climate change into management actions. And that's what I have. Anyone in the group want to add to that?
I think that was excellent, Jennifer. Thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer. And next we have group 3, which was Pablo Garza's group.
Yeah, the other Pablo. But so we were environmental flows and recharge. I fell a little short in my duties as facilitator, so we didn't designate a reporter, but I'll step in, and then others please add in if I miss something. I think generally there's a broad recognition that there's a lot of interest in recharge, to comply with SGMA, and but there's kind of a spectrum in our group of, in a lot of people, there's a spectrum in our group on, how bullish we might be or cautious we might be towards approaching recharge. And, the issue of environmental flows is in most cases, we don't have an environmental flow standard on a stream or river. And, there's a perspective that we shouldn't recharge, divert for recharge until those standards are in place. On kind of one end of the spectrum. On the other end, there's a kind of a perspective that the GSPs are including recharge as a project. It's going to have, it's going forward, and we need to figure out a way to make it work the best we can. And we talked about could there be an interim standard? I don't think we settled on any one. The Water Board has put like a 90% of average daily flow out there that works in some cases, in other cases it might not, but we didn't settle on what the right interim standard. And there's a concern that interim standards become permanent standards. Setting flow criteria is no simple task, as many of us have experienced. We could, if we put an interim standard out there, it could persist for a decade or more, and so there's concern about that. In terms of how it plays out on the ground, the GSPs are talking about it, but they don't have a lot of detail. They're just saying we're going to recharge and bring more water into the aquifer. We think where it plays out is at the Water Board over the water rights issues, and kind of as actors that change their water rights or apply for new water rights to actually do this. And I think we feel like we need to be active and really judge these projects on a case-by-case basis to make sure the kind of local conditions in terms of fish and wildlife needs and other needs are met before going forward with it. And we also talked about the impact that recharge can have on water quality, and that needs to be factored into the conversation, into the analysis as well, because that can impair drinking water supplies for communities. I'll stop there. Does anyone, did I miss any other key points in my group? Felice, Stacy, Sammy. All right.
Well, let me say this, Felice. I think one key point that I didn't hear was the 90%. It was pointed out kind of parenthetically that 90%, maybe 90% of very impaired flows, if you're below certain dams, 90% in the Scott, where I do a lot of my work, is the long-term average is way above our short-term average. So, 90% of what? Unimpaired flows, impaired flows? That's a key question.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks, Pablo and Felice, for your report back. And last we have group 4, which was Christina's group, who talked about water markets and fallowing. And Kelly is going to report out for us.
I'm Kelly. So we talked about water markets and fallowing, and it was a really great conversation. And I think it really highlighted how like a number of GSPs actually mention a lot of like different water trading and markets, but there's really no detail. And so how do we protect community environmental standards? And we talked about a lot of like really important things of needing representation in the GSA for the environmental justice and environmental sides, but not just looking at how engagement is important, but the actual representation. And so we can advocate for setting up the right type of rules for each type of basin. But then going into that too, we need hard data, but also the fact that the engagement process can actually tell us a lot about what users actually need and will need in the future, and how people feel too. And so some of the solutions we were thinking about were having defined management areas and really having like important set boundaries, because ways that at like large agribusiness can bring in water, trade water, can really like keep the inequalities in the system. So making sure that socially disadvantaged farmers that rent land or grow a lot of the row crops are protected in ways, because we're not going to live off of trees basically. So we need to find ways to make sure that those minority farmers are not marginalized in this type of like water trading system. And then also like looking at how some other water markets have already been playing out in terms of just on the other side of the country or surface water, and what we can learn for them, so we don't walk into the process blind and not foresee some of the challenges or outcomes that they have already experienced. I think we can learn a lot from those. Yeah, and then someone actually mentioned how maybe like a land trust can protect some of these like socially disadvantaged farmers who grow on like smaller farms. And then we kind of also talked about like, well, what is a small farmer? And that is also like a really important aspect of the conversation. So yeah, really just wanting to set up like a model for critically overdrafted basins that have ways to measure or like look at farming from like measurable objectives, and yeah, making sure like the management areas, if they're implemented or used, actually are able to protect some of the smaller minorities and socially disadvantaged farmers. Yeah, am I missing anything? Does anyone want to add something? Oh, and then also,
That was excellent.
yeah, oh, cool. That's, I've been going on too long.
No, great job, Kelly. Thank you. So some of the common themes I heard from each of your reports, that we need more engagement on the ground with the GSAs and more engagement with DWR, stronger representation, especially on some of those GSA boards, working together to fill the gaps that the GSAs are missing, and providing specific guidance for the GSAs in each of these 4 content areas. Would love to hear from everyone else if you have other reflections or things that came up for you while we were listening to the other groups report back, or if you have any questions that you would like to ask the other groups. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask verbally, or put your question in the chat box.
One thing that I would love to hear, and this can be either in the feedback or
something you can include in your evaluation survey is hearing all of these discussions. What's something that we as the collaborative should prioritize in taking on? There's a lot of things here in terms of guidance or engagement at the state level or GSA level. So I'd love to hear from folks what kind of priorities there are for the collaborative ourselves.
This is Christina. One thought, and it kind of builds off of what Emily said in a way, but relevant to markets. And I just want to give a shout out to the Community Water Center and many other participants on this list for the Community Water Markets Guide that they put together. And I think that was a good example of folks coming together. And it was a real process in terms of, you know, kind of voicing different opinions and thoughts, but coming together to kind of produce some guidelines on what protections we need to ensure for communities in terms of water markets. So I don't know, that resource might have been included in the packet. I don't remember, but if not, it would be a good resource to send around to the group.
Definitely, we'll make sure you add that to the follow-up resources.
Again, would love to hear from any of you what you think the priorities should be for the collaborative. Otherwise, you've all done really good work identifying options for us to pursue, and we'll continue to review them over the coming weeks to determine how best to move forward. But would love to hear directly from you now, as you've just had the opportunity to hear back from 4 different perspectives.
I think something important is that I know it would be very hard to do, but integrate some of the like agriculture folks into some of these conversations. Like they have so much power and so much, and they use most of the water. So if they are not, I mean, I know they have their own conversation going on, but just trying to bridge that gap between agriculture, environment, environmental justice. I think the more we talk among us, the more common ground we can get.
That's a great suggestion. Thanks, Pablo.
Yeah, Pablo, this is other Pablo, or Paul. You know, I think that that's important because even when we have a seat at the table with the GSA board, we're still a minority opinion. And so we have to have that collaboration to sway them to understand our side of things. So yeah, I think as much as we can have the conversations where they're part of it and we're part of their conversations, the better.
Yeah, could I just chime in? This is Stacy Sullivan from Sustainable Conservation. We have been working sort of collaboratively with people in agriculture for a long time, and I think it's important to realize, and I think this probably goes without saying, but just to recognize that agriculture is no more a monolith than the environmental movement or the environmental justice movement, and that there, you know, I think that there, you know, there are a range of people. There's a small but growing number of growers that we work with who are not just grudgingly accepting Sigma, but are really trying to figure out about how they're going to live and thrive in this situation, recognizing that they can't just live in the bunker. So I just want to second what Pablo just said. I think it's an important thing, and we're, you know, we're happy to explore our contacts, excuse me, in that area in order to try to set things up.
Contacts and contracts, I'm sure.
Yeah, that too.
And maybe part of the collaborative's effort can be lifting up some of those stories of those within the ag community who are not just grudgingly accepting Sigma, but thinking about how they're going to live and work within the boundaries of the legislation. Maybe we can lift up some of those stories as a part of our collaborative, and for those that are working with members of the ag community who fall into that category.
This is Jane. One group of people that I'm seeing in San Joaquin County, it's small, but younger people are involved in regenerative agriculture, and that might be a group that would be interested.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think we've started having some conversations with groups that represent small farmers and minority disadvantaged farmers in our area of work, our geographic area. And I think I think that's something we could think about, is including them for sure in these conversations. I think they share a lot of our interests. I do, though, I do have to voice some skepticism about engaging like big agriculture in these conversations, because at least, I mean, this is from my perspective in the agencies, the GSAs that I work with, but I think a lot of what we do here is really helpful to kind of ready ourselves to be in spaces where they are dominating, and they have been dominating, and they've not been listening to other interests for a really long time. So I think I'd want to be careful about who they are, whether we just have maybe some meetings that also include them, but also have our coalition, EJ, and environmental meetings, because I do think it's a useful space to kind of build our own strength before talking with them.
I think that's a really important point, Amanda. I think you're absolutely right that they're right in wrong places and times for different types of conversations.
Yeah, agreed. Because I also do see that every once in a while there are farmers that come to GSA meetings or are on GSA boards and do really seem to be wanting to see a similar vision for water use that we do. So they really want to make sure that drinking water is protected and environmental water needs are met. But yeah, I think we just would have to be careful about including them, and when to include them and when to talk with them, and kind of vetting who they are, I guess. Yeah.
I think we should have a follow-up call with Stacy and Amanda and a few others that might be interested on how best and when to engage farmers and which farmers to engage in this conversation. Feel free to keep talking. It's now officially your break. You have 25 minutes, a little less than 25 minutes now, to go prepare your lunch, stretch your legs, go for a run around the block if you need to. And then at 12:10, we're going to start our brown bag lunch panel with our 3 state agency representatives. And you'll have lots of time to ask them all of your burning questions. So please don't be late, but enjoy the break.